Today at Speedy's Garage, we're going to install some custom gauge faces into Project Orange Krush. To go along with the gauge faces, I also went with their Illuminated Needle Kit, which I really like. This is what it'll look like during the daytime when it's not illuminated. And they used a thick material for the needle itself, so it'll catch light in the sides and illuminate a little bit all on its own. But we also have the LEDs that will be installed on the gauge cluster itself. And this is a pretty nice setup. It's got a pulse width modulator adjustment there, so you can actually set the brightness of the needles when they're illuminated to your desired brightness level. It comes with very detailed instructions on how to do everything, so it should be a pretty fun project. So that's pretty much what the gauge faces will look like during the daytime. I did have them do a custom supercharged lettering there, and that was a font that was similar to the Challenger font. And then at night, they'll light up with that red behind them, which I think will look really good. The install is going to be pretty straightforward. I am going to use an assortment of various bits. Some of them will be Phillips head for some of the screws, and I believe the dash has some T15 or T20 Torx. They look like, let's see, hopefully you can see that. They look like that. They're kind of like star shaped. There we go. So you might need a couple of those, so make sure you have those on hand. I'll tell you exactly the size once we get to that step. Phillips head screwdriver. I'm planning to use a power driver to make things a little bit faster. Obviously you have to be very careful if you use something like that. And then I've got a hobby knife set. I'm planning to do one extra step, and I'll show you that when I get to it. It's going to involve this, some black paint, and some silicone sealant. The first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and pop out the car start button. I'm not going to need it in the way. And the next thing we want to do is we want to check the settings on our gauges before we start taking things apart. Okay, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to document where your needles are with the key on as well as off. Don't start the car, and I recommend you do this with the engine cold. That way you know that the coolant needle is in the right spot, cold. If you get this wrong, you'll have a lot of trouble knowing how fast you're going, the RPMs will be off and everything else, and that would be no bueno. I took a picture of each individual gauge, and I'm also going to make a small diagram and draw where the needles are so that I'm double sure I get it right. When you go to put your new gauge faces on and put your needles back in place, these images and the diagram will be what you'll reference to make sure your needles go back in the right spot. Now we can start taking things apart. We're going to start with the side trim piece, and it just pops out. Next we're going to remove this lower dash half here, and it's just a Phillips head screw on that side. There's one underneath which I've already removed. And make sure you keep up with your screws because there's a lot of them and they'll look the same. And then it just pops loose. Then we can unplug our light switch here, and then you can kind of, if you want to try to disconnect the hood latch release, you can. I usually just set it out of the way on the floor. Next, remove the two screws that hold this part of the dash, the bezel for your instruments in place. And there's one here, and there's one on the other side here. Now we can remove the trim, and there's a few tabs that go around the perimeter, so you're just going to have to kind of pull it. Watch your steering column. I'll show you. Looks like there's 3 tabs across the top and 1 tab on each side. And now we're ready to remove the actual cluster. It's held in place by 4 screws. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And it's probably helpful to use a long magnet for this so you don't drop them. If they get dropped into the dash, you're probably not ever going to find them again. A whole lot of the screws were already starting to look exactly the same with just small differences. So I decided to go ahead and take a piece of cardboard, mount them, and label them. So I made sure I got them right back in their homes where they're supposed to be when I go to put it back together. Okay, now we're ready to take the cluster out. I went ahead and protected the steering column with a microfiber towel. And if you just lean up, push back, should pop out. There we go. If you lean it forward, you can access the 3 plugs in the back, and they've all got tabs at the top that unlock them. Okay, next we need to remove the white bezel from the instrument cluster. This clear lens is extremely fragile. You can scratch it very easily, and it's very noticeable in the car if you do, so be very careful with that. I'm using a microfiber towel on top of a towel to make it cushioned, and you're only removing the 6 T15 screws around the perimeter of the black housing. And there's the part we're trying to get to. One final thing I'm going to do before I take the needles off is I'm actually going to mark them on the bezel. And if you gently turn them all the way to the left, you'll know they're seated at their stops. And then I used a silver Sharpie and I made a dot right at the tip of the needle point. Now the speedometer, I had to use a straight edge and do it on the opposite end. I laid it out like that and made my dot because the needle point will actually be on this piece, which will be taken off in a second. The tack I was able to do there, and then the temperature gauge I also had to use my straight edge, and I made my dot over here. And I also took one more photograph of the bezel just like it sits as a further reference to make sure I get the needles correct. Alright, now we're ready to remove the needles, and that's the scary part. I'm going to take a piece of paper and lay it over the gauge face to protect it. And I'm going to use one of the dash removal tools you've seen me use in some other videos. I'm going to gently put it underneath the needle face. I'm going to turn it counterclockwise and lift up on it. And that's how we do it. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the factory lens face from the instrument cluster, and this is actually 2 pieces. The front is the lens, behind it is an luminescent material. You don't want to mess with that. And you just lift up on it gently and it'll pop off the rings at the corner. Mine actually had 2 little areas where they had kind of sealed it to the lens face, so I'm going to have to work around those as well. Just little stobs. And then you just gently peel it up. And there you go. I seriously doubt I'll ever go back to those factory gauges, but I always keep all my stock parts for this car. I'll probably be buried in it, but in the event I do decide to ever sell it, the next owner would have everything factory if they wanted it. So what I did is I wrapped it in some saran wrap to keep it protected and clean. Next, just start laying the gauge faces on. And Black Cat made these in 4 separate pieces, so it makes them much easier to install. Before you touch them, wash your hands if you haven't already. And make sure, obviously, when you're doing any of this work, to keep a very clean work area. You don't want any dust to get on any of these or fingerprints or anything, so the less you touch them, the better. And all you do is lay them in place so that one side kind of goes over the connection, or the retaining tab rather, and then just kind of twist it into place. Once you have them installed, kind of line them up to where they look straight. And mine went on really easy. The only one that gave me a little bit of a challenge was the speedometer. I guess the tab was a little bit bigger than the others, and so I just used a flat blade screwdriver just to kind of help me get that started. And don't worry about any divots or anything. The needle bases are big enough that they're going to cover just about all of that. So when you put your needles back on, you won't see any of that anyway. Okay, if you're reusing the factory needles, you're almost done. Take your factory needle, gently put it back in place, line it up with your reference mark that you had before, then plug the cluster into the car, key the ignition on but don't start it, and make sure that with power the needles line up to where they were previously. However, I didn't like these white needles with the black instrument cluster. So I got the illuminated ones like I showed you before, and now we're going to get those installed because they're going to be a lot better. The factory gauge cluster used through lighting at night. The cluster was white. These needles do not light up from the factory. The light would just shine through them, illuminating them at night. With the black gauge faces, all you're going to see is a dark pointer moving around, and that's no bueno. So we're going to go with the illuminated ones. It's going to look a lot better and a lot more professional, because that's how we do it. To install the illuminated needles, we got a little more disassembly to do. However, I did go ahead and put the white bezel back on to protect the gauge faces. More of these T15 bolts. There's 2, 4, 6 that I see that I believe will need to be removed. A magnetic bit will help here. Next, we need to disconnect the illuminated panel from the front. Now we're going to remove some more of those T15 screws. And then you can lift the circuit board away from the gauge housing. That's the piece we need to work on. There's what the front looks like for those that are curious. Try to get it in the shot there. One of the tips that was mentioned in the instructions was to paint around the areas where the needles go through with a white paint. This will help the illuminated needles have a more uniform color. I didn't have white, so I just went back to my trusty silver Sharpie and did it that way. And I did a little bit extra around the perimeter so the light would reflect and go into the hole, and I also did the interior of the hole itself. Remember, your needle will plug in there so you won't see it, but still try to be neat so that you don't accidentally get somewhere you don't want it. Next, we're just going to install the light kit, and it's real straightforward. It just slips over the needle arms and is held in place with the tension. So ease them on there until they're snug but not too tight. And remember, your needles will actually hold them in place once you snap those on. And then just route the rest of the wiring up and out of the way. Next, reinstall the circuit board. Make sure that the little trip meter reset tab is already in place, the little button. Make sure that your EL connection is out of the way, and then put your screws back in. Now, I took them out using a power tool, but I'm always going to put them back in by hand to make sure I don't over tighten anything. And remember, you're going to do the 4 by the plugs first. Don't forget to connect the power cable for the back light on the gauges. And finally, you'll install your back plate, and you want to run the wires through, and I think this hole is probably going to be the best spot for your illuminated needles. And the pulse width modulator for controlling the brightness will fit through there as well. And now just install your 6 screws that held the back plate in place. They weren't the ones at the perimeter, remember. They're the ones more towards the center to hold it to the circuit board. Once you have all 6 of those in place, we need to get the needles set up. So there's where we're at so far. I think that's going to look pretty trick. To start setting up the needle set, we're going to gently put them in place, but don't push them on all the way. And I'm going to point them to the mark that I made earlier. I'm going to start with them pointing straight up. And then turn them until they line up to where I had them before. And I've got the needles gently in place now, and you'll notice I've lined them up with my reference marks that I used before. That one's there. And I checked them with a straight edge, just like before as well, to make sure they were perfect. So it should be in good shape. Now we want to take them over to the car. We want to hook the gauge cluster up and make sure that the needles line up with the key on ignition on but not started before we do final assembly. Okay, so I plugged the gauges back in. I didn't show you that because I figured it'd be pretty boring watching me be a contortionist trying to get those 3 plugs back in the gauge cluster without hitting the needles or the gauge faces. But long story short, plug it back in and then key on the ignition, but don't start the car. And then reference your pictures from before. So I printed mine out, and this is obviously with the key on. So I'm checking each one individually to make sure they line up pretty close. And it looks like, let's check the tachometer. So before it was dead set on 0 with the key on. That's pretty close. I think we can get it a little bit closer. So remember, these are barely installed. So I'm going to just turn this. And always turn them counterclockwise. I'm going to try to set it straight up on 0. That's pretty good, so then we're going to recheck. And those all look right. So now we can move on. When I was checking those in the car, I knew that the 1/2 inch mark was straight up and down factory. I knew that 80 miles an hour was straight up and down, 3,500 RPM, and the middle of the temp range. So that's how I set it up, and that's how I checked the needles, just as a reference point. And with that all aligned and everything in place, I went ahead and used some blue painter's tape just to secure the gauge faces to ensure that they don't ever move. The clear lens that goes on top also presses against them and holds them in place and actually pushes them into their channel that they're in. But for the rest of the work that I'm about to do, I didn't want them moving around on me and giving me any trouble, so that's how I solved it. And those blue pieces of tape will be completely hidden by the clear bezel when we put it on. And now that we know the needles are good to go, we can go ahead and push them the rest of the way on very gently. And you want to leave, and make sure you don't turn them, you just push down on them. And you want to leave about 1/8 of an inch gap between the needle and the surface of the gauge face. And we're going to double check the arrangement. Everything looks perfect. Now here's the next problem. The gauges are black and the bezel rings are going to be white. If you're happy with that, you're done. All you have to do is put it back together, and no, I haven't forgotten about the wiring, but it's literally 2 hookups. Very, very simple. I'll show you that in a minute. I'm personally not happy with that being white, so I want it to be satin black to match the gauge faces. Again, to make it a little bit more modern. I mean, that's why I'm doing this to begin with. The problem, they've used some kind of plastic weld all the way around the perimeter of this thing, and that holds the clear lens on. These no longer come off, and I know why they did it, to prevent debris or anything from getting inside the instrument bezel. It's a pretty smart thing to do if you're going to leave it like it is, but it makes it difficult for folks like us that want to modify things. I've taken an X-Acto knife, and that's what I showed you earlier, one of those from the kit that I have, and I tried to kind of start to cut into it to see how it would do. It's extremely brittle, and I think the risk of cracking this face is actually quite high, so I'm gonna have to come up with another solution. And boom, just like that, through the magic of YouTube videos, I've got the bezel masked off so we can paint it. Now how I did it, I used some pieces of manila folder out of my office. I found this worked better than just regular paper because it's thicker, and it actually created a better seal. What you want to do is try to seal around the edge there with the paper, and I would push on the lens very gently just to slide the paper underneath until I had it tight, and then where I overlapped the pieces I just taped them up with some painter's tape. Now we're ready for paint, and I think this was a lot easier than trying to cut through this plastic and pray that this lens didn't crack or shatter, and it only took me about a half hour to tape it up, so that's definitely the way to go. And the idea is to make sure you have a really good clean edge on your bezel where it meets the clear lens. And if you have to, use a small flat blade screwdriver just to very gently push on the tape to make sure it's flat if it gets up close to the bezel there. What you don't want to do is have any wrinkles or anything like that, because they will tend to show up when you try to paint them. So make sure it's smooth or you'll be sorry. To finish masking it off, I put some microfiber towels over the clear lens, covered it with newspaper, and then painter's tape to finish it up. Make sure you get it very well sealed off. And then you want to use some adhesion promoter. I've had really good luck with this painting plastic items. And then I personally like the Duplicolor enamels, and I got a flat for this. You don't want to have any reflections or anything or glare, so don't use a gloss. on it. I've already wiped it down with some grease and wax remover. I'm going to hit it with a tack cloth, a couple of coats of that, and then that, just following the directions on the cans. On the primer or adhesion promoter, it goes on clear. You're going to do 3 really light coats. Make sure you get all the angles since it's round. And on this, it's 3 minutes between coats, and then you want to top coat within 10 minutes. So the top coat obviously is going to be our black. And on the color coat, it's the same principle. You're going to do 3 to 4 very light coats. You can see that's my first one, and I am going to go ahead and make sure that I cover the entire back side and make it black so that any light that might bleed through from the illuminated back panel won't cause me any problems. So there it is, all painted. I started to go with the satin paint for this, but after painting it, I'm glad I went with the flat. It looks much better and was much easier to paint actually. You don't have to worry about the overlap as much. The trickiest part was getting in the top front of the Speedo and the tack area. You want to make sure you give those special attention so you don't end up with a light spot right there. You'll notice it when you're driving. And now we just need to let it dry overnight, and then we're ready for reassembly. Be careful that you don't get any runs when you're doing this. This is one of those paint jobs that has to look good at 2 feet because it's right in front of your face. Normal paint jobs, you know, 3 or 4 feet, 5 feet away, you won't notice little things, but this one you're going to. So be sure to take your time, and if I can do it, you can do it. And no matter how bad you want to touch this after you've painted it and before it's dried for 24 hours, do not do it. I want to touch it. No, I want to touch it. No. So there it is, all finished. Obviously the construction paper idea worked out great because the black has a very defined sharp line that I was looking for. I did go ahead and I used some clear coat polish. This is a Griot's product. It's a very, very mild abrasive with a clear coat polish. And with this being so soft, you want to test a small area to make sure it's not going to haze anything, but any clear coat polish should work. And then I polished the lens to get any scratches out of it over time that have occurred. And now it looks like brand new. And these lenses are super, super soft, so be careful, but you can do that at the end if you want it to look perfect. And now we can get on to reassembling and getting the lighted needles installed. Reassembly is just the reverse of removal. I'm going to start with the 2 center screws. Again, I'm doing this by hand so I don't break anything. I'm making them snug but not too tight. You want to do that for all 6. One last thing I did before final assembly is I really took a close look at all of the gauge faces as well as the bezel to make sure there wasn't any small pieces of debris in there that would show up after I put it back together. And then I gently blew it out, very gently, with some compressed air, and I did that to both the bezel and the gauge faces. It looks great, and now we're ready to put it back in the car. Now, as I showed you before, the LED illuminated needles have 2 connections. Black is ground, obviously, and it's a fork connector, and power, 12-volt power, is a spade. The kit came with a T-tap, and what you're going to tap is the wire in the gauge cluster that illuminates or gets 12 volts when the lights are turned on. So I'm going to show you that next. Okay, ground is easy. There are 2 screws behind the instrument cluster, and I'm going to use the right hand one. You can see that they screw into a metal brace. That will give us our ground. For 12-volt power, when the lights are on, you're going to use the white connector that goes to the back of the cluster. There is an orange with gray or silver stripe wire. It's right there. You're going to tap that with the T-tap, and I moved back about 4 or 5 inches from the connector so that it was out of the way of the cluster. Put your T-tap on that, and that's what your plus 12 volts is going to plug into. And to keep the uranium P32 space modulator in place, no, I'm kidding, that's the pulse width modulator for the brightness of the LED needles. I zip tied it in 2 places on each side of the little control knob so that it's nice and secure and it's close to the white plug, so that if I need to reach it later, I can get to it pretty easy. But this should be a set and forget. Once I get the brightness like I want it, I'll never have to adjust it again. Okay, so I connected it up. I tested it to make sure the brightness of the needles are where I want it to be. I set them probably 50%, so, or according to the little knob on the back, just enough light so that the needle illuminates evenly, so they're not too bright at night. And now we just reinstall our cluster, same as reverse of removal. It's 4 screws, as you'll remember. Hopefully remember which ones. Luckily I labeled them. And a magnet may help you get them in place. You don't want to drop one, obviously. With that installed, put the bezel back on. Don't forget the 2 screws at the bottom. Now reinstall the lower dash half. Don't forget to connect the trunk release button. Run the wire appropriately through the little space for it there. And finally, do one last check. Key the car on, but don't start it. And go back and reference your images one more time to make sure that the needles line up with where you expect them to be. And these do. And there's pretty much what the gauges are going to look like during the day. As you can see, they're black. I think painting the white bezel black was the right idea. If you come way to the side, you can just barely see a little bit of white, which isn't any big deal. It looks like part of the clear plastic lens or something. So no one would ever even notice that. You'll never see it because you're sitting straight in front of the gauges. It turned out real nice. Whoa! Whoa! There's what those gauges look like with the lights on at night. I am seriously digging that. I love that red background, the font on the numbers, premium fuel on my gas gauge so I know not to put crappy 87 in this supercharged car. I like that the numbers are now on the temp gauge instead of hot and cold. Everything looks great. And one final check you can do to make sure your needles are set right is if you have the EVIC, you can put it in information mode, which is the north arrow on the steering wheel as well as the music note pressed simultaneously for about 10 seconds. And it'll turn on information mode down there underneath the speedometer. And then you can kind of cross-check it. Making sure that the RPMs line up like they should, the coolant temperature, and the speed, which mine does, as you can see. Glad to know we got it right. From a time perspective, these gauge faces are a very high return on investment. This is something you're going to look at every time you get in the car, and so you'll be able to enjoy them all the time, every time you drive it. If you'd like to see some more how-to and other modifications, visit my website, www.speedysgarage.net, or hit subscribe in the bottom right corner.